Alright guys, today we're going to see why at persistence context is recommended for injecting the EntityManager. Usually when working with EntityManager, many people by mistake use at auto-wired. But officially, and even in best practices, at persistence context is the correct and recommended way. In this video, we'll go deep into why that is, and what a persistence context actually does behind the scenes. Alright, let's jump into it. Alright, if you remember, in the last video, we used at persistence context to inject our EntityManager. But actually, it doesn't inject the real EntityManager object directly. Instead, Spring injects a proxy. Why proxy? Because if you remember, I already told you earlier, EntityManager is not thread safe. That means, for every request or every operation, we need a fresh EntityManager. Now, there are actually two ways to handle this. First way. We can manually create a new EntityManager using the EntityManager factory. But in this case, we have to manage the entire transaction manually, like opening, committing, rolling back if something fails, everything ourselves. And trust me, it's a lot of extra work and prone to mistakes. Second way, and the easier one. We simply inject a proxy using at persistence context. Spring will automatically create and manage real EntityManager instances behind the scenes, per request, per transaction, without us worrying about it. Okay, let's try this in code and actually see it in action. First, inside our saveEmployee method, let's add a log. Just to check whether the EntityManager is a proxy or a real object. Follow exactly what I do on my screen. Alright, let's do one more thing. We'll wrap the entire saveEmployee logic inside a try-catch block. This way, if any exception occurs, we can log it properly and rethrow it. Follow along. Do the same as I'm doing on my screen. Alright, first things first, let's test with the at persistence context annotation. Start the application. Open dbeaver and check the current state of the employee records. As you can see, there are 48 records in the table, and the last employee ID is 56. Now, let's go to Postman and add a new employee. I'm going to add Rahul Kumar. Let's hit the request and see what happens. Great! We got the success response, and as you can see, the employee ID returned is 57. Now, let's open dbeaver and verify this in our database. And there it is, employee ID 57 is present, and it's Rahul Kumar, just like we expected. Now, let's open IntelliJ and check the console log. See here in the logs, it's printed, EntityManager is of shared EntityManager proxy for target factory. When we use the at persistence context annotation, Spring injects a proxy for the EntityManager, not the actual instance. This means Spring takes care of managing the underlying EntityManager and transactions behind the scenes for us, making it easier to work with JPA without manually managing the EntityManager. Now, see on my screen, when we call EntityManager.persist, it actually invokes the invoke method of shared EntityManager creator. What happens here is that Spring's shared EntityManager creator fetches the correct EntityManager for the current transaction. So, the actual work of managing the transaction and entity is handled automatically by Spring for us. If you go a bit further in the code, you'll notice that Spring also takes care of closing the EntityManager when it's done with the operation. Here's how it works. If Spring creates a new EntityManager for this specific operation, it will automatically close it once the operation completes. However, if there's already an existing entity manager from a previous transaction flow, it will keep that one open, so we don't unnecessarily create and close multiple instances. This is all part of Spring's transaction management, ensuring that resources are efficiently managed without any manual intervention from our side. Okay, now let's make a small change. Replace the @persistence context annotation with @autowired on our Entity Manager field. Done? Perfect. Now, restart the application and let's see what happens. Alright, now switch to Postman. I'm going to add Mohit Kumar. Okay, hitting the request. Awesome. See, we got a success response and the employee ID is 58. Now quickly switch to dbeaver. And yup, there it is, employee ID 58, name Mohit Kumar, saved perfectly. Okay, now open IntelliJ. Look carefully, even with it auto-wired, we are still getting a proxy object for the Entity Manager. So it's working similarly to when we used @persistence context. Basically, both are behaving almost the same way here. Proxy object, automatic transaction handling. Everything working fine. Actually, Spring internally creates the Entity Manager as a shareable bean, meaning it's a proxy object, not the real Entity Manager itself. So even when we use it auto-wired, it's still injecting a proxy, not the actual instance. That's why, at the moment, both @persistence context and auto-wired are behaving exactly the same. Now, let's do a small experiment in the code and see what really happens. Alright, now let's create a new class. We'll call it EntityManagerConfig. This class will be responsible for manually creating and exposing a real Entity Manager bean, not the proxy one. Follow along on my screen. Mark it as a configuration class. Okay, let's create the Entity Manager factory bean. Follow along with me. We'll use local container Entity Manager factory bean to create the bean. Add a method called Entity Manager Factory. This method will return an object of type local container Entity Manager factory bean. Now, this bean will take data source as an input. Okay. Create local container Entity Manager factory bean object. Set the data source for the Entity Manager, that's where all your DB interaction happens. Set the persistence provider, Hibernate in our case. We're specifying Hibernate as our persistence provider, which is the framework responsible for managing our JPA entities. Next, set the package where Spring will scan for entities. And last, set a name for the unit of persistence. And finally, return the local container Entity Manager factory bean object. Okay, next up we need to configure our transaction manager so that Spring can handle transactional calls correctly. Create another bean of type Platform Transaction Manager. Declare a bean method named Transaction Manager. Takes the Entity Manager factory that we defined earlier. In our case, we'll use JPA Transaction Manager. So create a new JPA Transaction Manager, set its factory, and return it. Alright, now we've reached the really interesting part. We've been talking about how EntityManager is not thread safe, and that means we need a new instance for each request or transaction. So, let's create an EntityManager bean ourselves. Take the EntityManager factory as an input parameter. Call createEntityManager method of EntityManager factory and return. Okay, simple. EntityManager bean is created. Okay, now here's the big question. We've just created our own singleton EntityManager bean by calling createEntityManager method of EntityManager factory inside an addBean method. We no longer have Spring's proxy doing the magic for us. So, will a persistence context and even at AutoWired still work correctly? Will our persist method calls still run in a transaction, or will we see errors? Okay, first let's test with @persistence context. See, it's currently annotated with @AutoWired. Simply replace that annotation with @persistence context. Alright, let's restart the application. Alright, switching over to Postman. I'm going to add Rohit Kumar this time. And now hit send. Perfect. We got a response with employee ID 59. That means everything is working just fine with our EntityManager setup. Now let's go ahead and open dbeaver to double check. And there it is, employee ID 59, Rohit Kumar, correctly saved to the database. Okay, let's open IntelliJ and check our console logs. See here, even though we created our own EntityManager bean and injected it with that persistence context, we're still seeing a proxy object being printed. Why is that? Well, this is by design. Spring's JPA integration always wraps the EntityManager in a proxy, specifically a shared EntityManager proxy, so it can safely handle thread scoping and transactions under the hood. Even if you supply your own EntityManager bean, the @persistence context injection mechanism will return that proxy, not the raw instance. So bottom line, getting a proxy is expected. It's how Spring makes sure each transaction/request gets the correct EntityManager without you having to manage it yourself. Alright, now let's test it with @AutoWired. So first, change the annotation from @persistence context to @AutoWired on the EntityManager field. Now, restart the application. Let's see what happens this time. Alright, now switch to Postman. Let's add a new employee. I'm going to add Ankit Kumar this time. Done? Now, hit the send button and let's check the response. Okay, we got a success response. But wait. Look carefully, the employee ID is 0. What just happened? Let's open dbeaver quickly. See? No new employee has been added in the database. Now switch to IntelliJ. Look at the console carefully. When we used @AutoWired, instead of getting a proxy object, Spring actually injected the real EntityManager object, the bean we manually created. And that's the real problem. Because EntityManager is not thread safe, and since it's not a proxy now, Spring is not managing transactions properly behind the scenes. That's why our data did not get saved. And if you notice, no exception was even thrown in the logs. Silent failure. Super dangerous in real projects, right? And that's why it's recommended to use @persistence context instead of @AutoWired for injecting EntityManager. Alright, now since we don't need this custom setup anymore, let's clean everything up and bring our project back to the standard setup. First, delete the EntityManager config class that we created. Make sure we are only injecting EntityManager using @persistence context again, because that's the safest and recommended way. Alright, quick summary. Today we understood why using @persistence context is highly recommended over @AutoWired for injecting EntityManager. We also saw what can go wrong if a real Entity Manager instance is injected instead of a proxy, like transactions not working and no data being saved. So always prefer at persistence context when working with Entity Manager in Spring Boot. In the next video, we'll move ahead and learn how to fetch data using the ID column, simple and very useful. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, press the notification bell, and drop a like if you found this helpful. See you in the next video.